quick review of the new material from yesterday, the new things that showed up on our timeline. Obviously, last Friday, we declared our independence, but that doesn't mean anything unless you fight for it. And that doesn't even mean anything unless you win, right?
Just a few
So we got into the war yesterday.
You wanted me to remind you to tell us the story?
Thank you. Good work, Ethan. So yesterday we had some glorious victories. We defeated the Hessians at Trenton, Washington's bold move of crossing the Delaware on Christmas night took the Hessians by surprise. And then shortly after that we had a victory at Princeton. And then several months later, October of 1777, we had the Turning Point victory way up in Saratoga, New York. Why was that the turning point of the war? What changed after that? Kateri?
That's when France was going to be joining the American side.
Yeah, France joined the war on our side. But we know that there were not all victories. There were some setbacks, there were some losses in battles, and a really difficult time of suffering was the winter of 77 and 78 at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, and that's where we left off. And we were talking about this great painting of Washington's prayer at Valley Forge, and we said there's a story that goes with it. We ran out of time, and Ethan just reminded us we got to start with this story. Remember, we said that from this story, we get a peek into the father of our country, George Washington. We can see what his character is like. But before we get into it, who remembers what is the difference between reputation and character? Anybody remember that? Not going to be on a quiz, but just curious. Anybody remember what's the difference between your reputation and your character? Matt?
Your reputation is like what people see and what people see you do. Your character is like what you do by yourself and no one else on you.
Right. Reputation's what others think of us. Character is what we are based on what we do when we're alone. No one will know. And based on that definition, it's impossible to know anyone else's character except our own. But I just said we can know George Washington's character because that's what this story's about. He got caught doing what he does when he's alone and no one will ever find out. So the story goes like this. There was a local farmer that lived near Valley Forge, a man by the name of Isaac Potts. Now you tell me based on what you've learned, if he was living in Pennsylvania in the 1700s, there was a pretty good chance. What was his religion?
Quaker?
He was a Quaker. Remember that?
Quaker, yeah.
A lot of Quakers in Pennsylvania. And remember, one of the strange beliefs that Quakers had is that they're pacifists and they don't believe in fighting, not even in wars. So to a Quaker like Isaac Potts, what kind of a man would George Washington be?
Terrible man.
A terrible man, right? Not only is he a soldier, but he leads other men in battle since he's a general. So to a Quaker, George Washington would be an evil man, right? The way they would think. Well, Isaac Potts was out walking in the woods that winter, and he heard something off in the distance. He went to investigate, and this painting here, this shows what he saw. We know that because he later described what he saw to the artist who painted this painting. He said he saw a man, and he knew right away that it was George Washington. I mean, he knew the army was camping at Valley Forge, and based on how this man was dressed, it was pretty obvious he was the general, right? It was George Washington, and apparently this was George Washington's habit. He would ride out into the woods by himself each day and kneel and pray out loud. And Isaac Potts witnessed that. And he
What about if
overheard.
someone chases him?
I'm sorry, what?
What about if someone chases him and kills him?
Why would they do that? Who's gonna do that?
The enemy?
No, the enemy is nowhere near Valley. They're in Philadelphia. Alright, so he's out praying on his knees. Isaac Potts overhears him. And George Washington was not praying for himself. Now, first of all, is there anything wrong with praying for yourself? No. In fact, the Bible instructs us to do that. It says to make your request to God. Tell him what's on your mind, what you need, what you want. Right? He desires that. He answers prayers. Right? So he wants us to pray for ourselves. Nothing wrong with that, but there is another kind of prayer we call intercessory prayer. That's when we intercede on someone else's behalf. Basically means we pray for other people. I'm sure all of us have done both, right? We pray for ourselves and we pray for other people. Well, George Washington, according to Isaac Potts, was praying very fervently for his men, pleading to God to meet their needs, ease their suffering, because it was a rough time at Valley Forge. And Isaac Potts was impressed by that. George Washington never knew he was being spied on. All right, the rest of the story, Isaac Potts goes home, plops down in his chair, and his wife says, Isaac, what troubles thee? He said, I saw something today I didn't think I would ever see. And he told his wife that he saw General Washington and that he was a great man of God. His wife turned up her nose, because to her that's impossible. He's a soldier, he's a general, he leads other men in battle, fighting is wrong. So to a Quaker, that doesn't compute that you could be a Christian and a soldier. But Isaac Potts knew it was true. And even as a Quaker, he realized it is possible to be a Christian, to be a believer, and to be a soldier. Well, we know that, right? Our history is full of examples. George Washington is just one example. He's a great man of God and a great warrior on the battlefield. And even right now, in our country, there are thousands and thousands of Americans that are Christians and warriors on the battlefield defending our freedoms. So to us, it's not surprising, but to Isaac Potts, the Quaker, it was surprising. And he made a prediction. He told his wife that he believes God is going to use George Washington in great ways. Yeah, he was right, wasn't he? So, but here's why I love that story, because George Washington, we call him the father of our country. He's our first president. He's the hero general in this big war. He's on Mount Rushmore. He's on the dollar bill. We named the nation's capital after him. We have the Washington Monument. We hung his picture in our classroom. He's the father of our country. And we admire him for all his accomplishments. And his accomplishments are great. But isn't it awesome that be able to actually know that not just did he have great accomplishments, but he was actually a great man of character. And we know because he got caught doing what he does when no one will know. He prayed for other people. What a testament to the character of the father of our country. That's why I like that story so much. All right, well, let's continue on our timeline up to the next event. All right, on our timeline, it takes place in October 1781. Now, I'm not saying this is the very next thing that happened. I mean, there's some years have gone by here, right? It's not the next thing that happened. It's just the next thing on our timeline. Next thing we're going to talk about. The war continued on. There were dozens and dozens of other battles. Some were victories, some were devastating defeats. It's a long, bloody war. Now we're going to fast forward to the final battle. It's October 1781. We know we're going to win, right? It's where the British surrendered at Yorktown, which happens to be in Virginia. So here is kind of how that went down. British General Cornwallis was fighting in the south, the southern colonies, trying to destroy them as much as he could. But he was having problems not from an American army, but from patriot guerrilla warriors. What is a guerrilla warrior? Anybody know? What do you think, Matt?
Someone that like hides in the forest.
Yeah, somebody that hides. They're not going to lead an army out in a field in a conventional battle against the British Army, but these patriot Americans, using guerrilla warfare, would do ambushes, they'd hide in the swamps, and just kinda make attacks and then run off, but they weren't so much fighting the British Army as they were harassing the British supply lines for their army. Think about this. If you have an army of thousands like Cornwallis had, that takes a lot of supplies. You need a lot of ammunition and gunpowder and boots and blankets and medical supplies and most of all food. And all that stuff has to get to your army somehow, and that's on wagons, supply wagons, coming from somewhere. Well, these guerrilla warriors, these patriots, were attacking those supply lines, destroying it, stealing it, whatever. So Cornwallis was frustrated. He couldn't supply his army. So he decided to go to the coast to get resupplied. He chose a little town on the Virginia coast called Yorktown, and he was going to get a British ships to bring him fresh supplies and to bring him fresh soldiers, reinforcements. So Cornwallis, the British general, is hoping his army will get bigger and better supplied. All he has to do is wait on those ships to arrive on the coast, so he's gonna go to Yorktown. Now I know you can't see it here on my map, but Yorktown is on the very end of a peninsula, a little finger of land sticking out into the Chesapeake Bay. We know all about peninsulas, right? We live on one, right? We're surrounded by water on three sides. And that's why Cornwallis decided to choose Yorktown. He thought, while I'm waiting for those ships to come up from the ocean and bring me extra men and supplies, I only have to defend in one direction. Nobody can attack me from the left, or the right, or the rear, because there's water. As long as I can defend my front here, I can wait for my ships to arrive and bring me more men and supplies. But in the meantime, General George Washington finds out that Cornwallis is in Yorktown, and it's time for a new character in our story. Someone that is a great American hero that isn't even an American. All right, new character. There he is. Now, I know, he looks like a sissy, but looks can be deceiving. All right, this is the Marquis de Lafayette. He's not an American, he's a Frenchman. He's a young man in his 20s. And when our war for independence started, he's an aristocrat from France. In other words, he's kind of a rich brat. He's from a rich family, he's got great education, but when he finds out that the Americans are fighting for their independence, fighting for their freedom, he wants to come over to the United States and help us. It's not even his country. But guess what? His parents wouldn't let him. He wasn't old enough. But he was so inspired by our fight for freedom. So when he did become old enough, and he could make his own decisions, he decided to come over here. Now, he had formal military training, and he ends up becoming good friends with George Washington, and he's a big help. Because George Washington had no formal military training, but Lafayette did. So he comes over to help us, and think about that. He's not fighting for his freedom, is he? He had it made. He's a rich kid from France. He's fighting for the idea of freedom. Thinks it's a noble cause, so he's gonna help us. And this was even before Saratoga. Even before France started helping us, Lafayette was already helping us. And then, of course, after Saratoga, when France got involved on our side, and they sent soldiers, Lafayette becomes one of the commanders of the French army. That's why even today, we have monuments and memorials and statues to Lafayette, one of our American heroes, even though he wasn't even an American. He was fighting for the noble cause of freedom in general, specifically for our freedom. Pretty cool guy. All right, so anyway, back to our story at Yorktown. George Washington starts marching down the peninsula toward Cornwallis's army. with his Patriot American army. Cornwallis comes marching down with his French army. Uh-oh, not Cornwallis, I'm sorry, did I say Cornwallis?
Yes.
Lafayette comes marching down with the French army. So we have George Washington and the Americans, Lafayette and the French army, and Cornwallis is not going to get help from the British ships because remember the French Navy, they're on our side. The French Navy blockades Yorktown, so the British ships can't get to Cornwallis. So is Cornwallis gonna get extra soldiers? Nope. Is he gonna get new supplies? Nope. And all of a sudden, he's cornered. What he thought was a good location on this peninsula ends up being a trap. He made his own trap. He can't retreat to the left, he can't retreat to the right, he can't retreat to the rear.
Swim.
He can't retreat this way because the enemy, the French army and the American army are coming, and he's not getting any help because of the French Navy blockading the British ships. So there's a battle at Yorktown, and Cornwallis is forced to surrender. Alright, so here's a great famous painting about that. Another very famous painting from this time period of Cornwallis's surrender at Yorktown, October 1781. Cornwallis, of course, is in the red coat, and he is surrendering. Can anybody find George Washington on this picture? He's usually pretty recognizable. Can you see him?
No.
Over here, isn't he? On the darker horse. Cornwallis is not surrendering to George Washington, and that's part of the story. He refused to surrender to George Washington. He said, I'm not going to surrender to that farmer. Because he did not have respect for George Washington, because Washington had no formal military training. So we did have a general that had some military training, so we allowed Cornwallis to surrender to him instead. Which is another testament to George Washington's character, his humility. He doesn't care. He doesn't care if he gets the credit, if he gets the glory. He wasn't fighting for fame or glory. He was just fighting for our freedom. We won, right? Who cares who gets the credit? That's another testament to the character of the father of our country. He is a great man. We could admire him, not just for his accomplishments, but for his character. Well, anyway, remember the armies traveled with musicians, bands. So the story goes that at this moment, the British band struck up a song, started playing a song, just randomly, and the title of the song they were playing was appropriate. The title of the song was "The World Turned Upside Down." Think about it. That is appropriate, because what just happened? A bunch of farmers with guns just defeated the most powerful military in the world. That's impossible. That's absolutely impossible. I mean, you can go back to Patrick Henry when he said, "Give me liberty or give me death." As inspiring as that is, the odds are it's going to be death. Right? How in the world can a bunch of farmers with guns defeat the most powerful military in the world? It's impossible. But remember, what's impossible with men is possible with God. So apparently, God must have blessed our rebellion to tyrants, right? Because we ended up winning this impossible war. 5 long years ago, we declared our independence, 1776. But again, that means nothing unless you fight for your independence. And even fighting means nothing unless you win. And we did it. The final battle was at Yorktown. The world had turned upside down. Any questions on Yorktown? It's a victory now. The fighting is over, but wars do not officially end until there is a peace treaty. So we're gonna talk about treaties all year long, we're gonna talk about peace treaties a lot. So we need to know some things here. First of all, you need to know that a treaty means a written agreement between two countries. A written agreement between two countries is a treaty. A peace treaty is a written agreement between two countries after a war. Right? Think about it. When a war is over, whatever they were fighting about, we have to figure out, well, what's gonna happen now going forward, right? If they were fighting over land, or fighting over, rights at sea, or whatever they were fighting over, we have to put it in writing, well, what's gonna happen now? So what happens is, all the countries that were involved in the war send representatives to a peace conference. Alright, so in this case, Britain's gonna send some people. France, of course, was involved, they're gonna send some people. The United States, we won, so we get to send some people. Who were our representatives at the peace conference?
Washington?
No, George Washington wasn't there.
Benjamin
There's
Franklin?
3 men, representatives at this peace conference after our war for independence. Who were they? Caitlin?
Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, and John Adams.
There they are. Ben Franklin, John Jay, John Adams are the 3 Americans. And peace treaties are always named, actually usually named, after the place where the peace conference was held, where the negotiations, where the men get together and decide what's gonna happen now. So obviously this one took place in Paris because the peace treaty that ends our war for independence is called the Treaty of Paris. Look at the year though, 1783. So the fighting's been over for 2 years, but the war doesn't officially end until all the countries sign the peace treaty, Treaty of Paris. Yes?
Wait, you said it was John Adams, Ben Franklin, and who?
John Jay. So now we're our own country, we're our independent country. What do you mean we're a country? Well, we have to have some boundaries, don't we? Where does our country start and end? Well, that's what's in the peace treaty. That's what's in the Treaty of Paris. So here's a map of North America after the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The only part we're really worried about is the green part, our country, the United States. Everybody agrees. We know, France knows, and guess what? King George III in Britain knows. They all agree. They put it in writing. We are a free and independent country. We're no longer part of England. We're the United States of America. But what are our boundaries? We go from the ocean all the way to our western boundary, which was what in those days?
Mississippi.
I don't know if you can see that, but that's the Mississippi River. That's as far west as we went. That's the entire United States as of 1783. You can see it doesn't even include Florida. Who did Florida still belong to?
Spain.
Still part of Spain. Now, Britain still had some land in North America. That's Canada. That was British Canada. Still part of Britain, just like we were once part of Britain, right? Until we got our independence. So that's Treaty of Paris, 1783. It establishes our boundaries all the way out to the Mississippi River. Now the war is officially over. We are an independent country. Let's talk about that for a minute. That's what you all are hoping for someday, your own personal independence. Right now, you're not independent. You are dependent on your parents, right? That's who pays for the roof over your head. That's who pays for your food. That's who pays for the doctor when you get sick, right? You're not independent, you're not on your own. You depend on them every day of your life. Now, you are more independent than when you were in first grade, right? I bet you have a later bedtime. Alright, I bet you don't have to hold mom's hand when you cross the street anymore like you did in first grade, right? You have more independence than you did then, but you're not completely independent. But someday, you will be, right? Kinda reminds me, my son, who's 28 years old, just got home last night from a great adventure he's been on. He's been on a hike in the mountains for over 2,000 miles. It took him 6 months. Great adventure. Now he's gonna come home and rest a little bit. He flew in to the airport last night and I went and picked him up. I kinda teased him. I said, if you just walked 2,000 miles, why couldn't you walk home from the airport? Why do you need a ride, right? But I gave him a ride home. He's gonna stay with us for a little while and then kinda get things going again after this adventure. But, do you think I gave him a bedtime when he got home?
No.
No. He's independent of me, isn't he? You think tonight at dinner I'm gonna tell him he has to eat his broccoli? No, he's a big boy, he can decide. Right? You think I'm gonna tell him, you shouldn't watch that movie, that's not appropriate? No. He's independent of me, right? But also if he says, hey, Dad, I need some money for gas. Am I gonna give him money for gas?
Yeah.
No. He's independent of me. He's on his own, right? Now, he'll still ask me advice, that always makes me feel good. Hey Dad, what do you think I should do about this? That's great. But I don't get to decide his life for him, do I? But I also, he doesn't get to be taken care of by his dad anymore. That's what independence means. See, there's two sides of that. The good news is nobody's telling you what to do, but what goes along with that is the responsibility is you have to set your own guidelines. You have to provide for yourself, right? So you'll be independent of your parents someday, completely on your own. Well, now let's go back to our country. Now that we have not just declared our independence, not just fought for our independence, but we actually won our independence. It's in a treaty, we got a country. What's our next big challenge? Now what? What do we have to do?
A government?
We gotta set up a government. We gotta figure out how to run our own country. We can't depend on Britain or the king anymore, right? They don't get to make the rules, we're on our own, but how are we gonna make the rules? How are we gonna enforce the rules? Good question. Victoria,
Wait, how did we get the rest of US?
stick around, that's what the rest of the year's about. We're only in September, right? We got a lot of history class to go. Yeah, that's what the rest of it's about, how the rest of the map develops. Good question. Alright, so one thing we knew about setting up our own government is we're not gonna have any kings, are we? We know we don't like that idea. But what kind of government will we set up now that we're independent? Well, here is the very tricky challenge we face. First of all, as Americans, one word, what do we care about?
Freedom?
Freedom. We did then, we do now, that's what we're all about. So we realize when we set up our government, we have to be careful because if we set up a government with too much power, the government has too much power over us, then we will lose our freedoms. Because our own government will become a tyrant and take away our freedoms. You know, like King George III did. So we gotta be careful. We don't wanna set up a government with too much power, but on the other side of that, if we set up a government that is too weak, not powerful enough, too weak so that it can't defend our freedom, and then some enemy of our freedom, maybe an outside country someday, might attack us and we lose our freedom. You see the dilemma here? This is a tricky balance. If we set up a government with too much power, we lose our freedom to our own government. They become tyrants. If we set up a government with not enough power, we lose our freedom to another country. So we have this challenge, this real balancing act. We have to figure out some way to set up a government that is powerful enough to defend our freedoms so other countries can't take it, but not so powerful that our own government can become a tyrant and take away our freedoms. That's not easy. That's very tricky if you're a people like Americans are that care about freedom. How do you set up a government strong enough to defend your freedom, but not strong enough to take your freedom? Well, I'll tell you, tomorrow we're gonna talk about our first try at that, and our first try was a disaster. It didn't work. We'll talk about what was wrong with it tomorrow.